Marcus Webb was 17 when the state of New Mexico decided he was no longer their responsibility. He'd aged out of the foster care system, and the last family that had taken him in was moving out of state. The caseworker had given him a folder of documents and a bus ticket to Raton, a high desert town north of Santa Fe where he had a distant relative who supposedly owed him nothing but was willing to provide an address. Marcus had spent the last 6 years moving between houses, each one feeling less like home and more like a temporary storage facility for unwanted children. The relative's house was smaller than he expected and smelled like cigarette smoke and resignation. The man wanted nothing to do with him. Within 3 weeks, a lawyer's letter arrived, forwarded through the state, addressed to Marcus in care of a relative whose name he barely knew. His grandfather had died, the man he'd met exactly twice, both times as a confused child who didn't understand why everyone was quiet and serious. The letter contained a deed to a property in the New Mexico desert, east of Carrizozo, on the high plateau where the earth was cracked and the sky was the color of old bone. The property was listed as worthless. The lawyer explained this with the apologetic tone of someone delivering bad news. The land itself has no value. The mineral rights were stripped decades ago. There's an old mining operation, a silver mine, mostly worked out. The structures are unstable. I'd recommend you contact a land developer about selling. The property might bring a few $1,000s for the raw acreage. A few $1,000s. Marcus could get a room somewhere. He could work at a gas station or construction site and build something that resembled a life. But something about the deed made him want to see the place before he sold it. He took a bus, then hitched a ride with a man hauling feed to a remote ranch, getting dropped at a dirt road that climbed toward the highest point of the plateau. The landscape was brutal in its vastness. Cracked earth stretched in every direction, dotted with skeletal juniper and sagebrush, the rocks the color of old blood and rust. The sky above was immense and empty, a blue so pale it was almost white. He walked the last mile, his backpack heavy, his lungs burning in the thin, high-altitude air, and came to the property as the sun was sliding toward the western edge of the world. The mine entrance was a dark mouth carved into the red rock face of a low hill, surrounded by the ruins of old structures. A wooden shaft house had partially collapsed, its timbers weathered gray and split like old bones. Rusted mining equipment lay scattered across the hard earth, an ore cart with a broken wheel, chains, pulleys, tools whose purpose had been forgotten. A small wooden cabin, the color of driftwood, sat 50 yards from the mine entrance, its door hanging crooked on rusted hinges. Everything about it suggested abandonment. Everything spoke of failure and neglect. Marcus stood in the high desert quiet and felt something shift inside him. He owned this, not because he'd earned it or built it or wanted it, but because he'd been born into a family that owned it. The deed in his backpack gave him this worthless piece of earth. And for the first time in 17 years, he had something no one could take away from him. The cabin had no electricity, no running water, but it had a roof that mostly didn't leak and walls that held the heat of the day even as the desert cooled to freezing at night. Marcus slept on the floor wrapped in his jacket and dreamed of nothing, which was better than the dreams he usually had. In the morning, he explored. The mine entrance was sealed with an iron gate, locked decades ago, but the lock was corroded and useless. He forced it open, and the smell hit him immediately. Damp earth and minerals, a deep, cool smell that seemed to come from the center of the world. He found a kerosene lamp in the cabin and lit it, and descended into darkness. The mine shaft descended at a gentle angle, the walls glittering faintly in the lamplight. Silver had been pulled from here, yes, but the real geology of the place was visible in the stone around him. The rock itself was fascinating, veins of different minerals running through it, some gleaming faintly in the lamp's glow, others dark and rough. He descended deeper, following the main shaft, walking where miners had walked a century ago. And then he found something that stopped him cold. The mine shaft widened into a chamber, and the chamber was not empty. In the lamplight, he could see walls covered entirely with shelving, metal shelves, carefully constructed, holding containers. Row after row of glass jars, metal boxes, sealed containers of various sizes. The temperature in the chamber was cool and stable, perfect for storage. The air itself felt preserved, like it had been waiting for someone to return. There was a desk in the corner, ancient wood and metal, and on the desk was a journal. The leather binding was cracked but intact. Marcus sat on a stone bench that had been carved deliberately into the rock. Someone had shaped this place to be lived in, and opened the journal. The first page was dated 1987. The handwriting was careful, deliberate, the writing of someone who knew the importance of recording things correctly. The entries began with observations about the chamber itself, about its geological stability, its temperature regulation, its natural protection from surface heat and weather. But then the entries shifted into something else entirely. My research on extremophile organisms has been halted by the university. They don't understand the implications. The microorganisms that survive in extreme pH conditions, in radioactive soils, in temperatures that should be lethal, they're not just surviving, they're adapting. They're evolving mechanisms that could help us understand how life persists in conditions we thought were impossible for life. But the university wants commercial applications, wants something we can sell. Pure research doesn't pay the bills anymore. I'm taking the specimens, the research, the cultures to the mine. No one comes here. No one cares. I'll continue the work alone if I have to. This is too important to abandon. Marcus read entries spanning 30 years. His grandfather, a man he'd met twice as a confused child, was a scientist, a biologist, someone who'd abandoned his career at a university to continue research that no one else believed in an old mine in the New Mexico desert. The entries detailed the collection of extremophile microorganisms from around the world. Bacteria that lived in boiling hot springs, organisms that survived in acid that would dissolve flesh, microbes that thrived in conditions that seemed to violate the basic rules of biology. And Thomas Webb, his grandfather, had created a living library in this mine chamber, carefully preserving these specimens, continuing his research, documenting mechanisms of adaptation that were decades ahead of their time. The final entry was dated 15 years ago. The handwriting was shakier, less precise. My hands are becoming unreliable. The arthritis is advancing faster than I'd hoped. I've made detailed notes on the preservation protocols, on the environmental controls I've set up, on the specimens and their origins. This collection represents the life's work of a dedicated scientist. But more than that, it represents the future. These organisms will teach us how life can persist, how it can adapt, how it can survive in conditions we thought were impossible. If someone finds this, if someone who understands comes to this place, protect the work. This is legacy. This is the future of our species' relationship with life itself. Marcus sat in that underground chamber and wept, not from sadness, but from the sudden clarity that his grandfather had not abandoned him. His grandfather had built something, had dedicated decades to work that no one else understood, that no institution would support, that he had to protect in secret. And then, somehow, impossibly, he'd left it to Marcus, trusting that someday his grandson would arrive at this worthless desert mine and understand what he'd built. The mine chamber had climate controls, ingenious mechanical systems that regulated temperature and humidity without electricity, using the natural properties of the earth itself. The specimens in their containers were still viable, still alive. The water dripping from the ceiling was collected in sealed systems. Everything was designed to function indefinitely, to preserve what had been created. Marcus spent a week in the mine, reading every entry in his grandfather's journal, learning the preservation protocols, understanding the specimens and their origins. And then he faced a choice: sell the property for a few $1,000s and try to build a normal life, or protect this legacy and accept that his life would be tethered to a desert mine in the middle of nowhere. Then Dr. Eleanor Vance arrived, and the choice was taken from him. She pulled up in a dust-covered SUV, a woman in her late 40s with graying auburn hair and intelligent eyes, wearing an expedition vest and the attitude of someone used to getting what she wanted. She represented Biogenesis Corporation, she explained, and they'd been looking for Thomas Webb's research for 15 years. "We have funding, we have laboratories, we have the infrastructure to understand what your grandfather was doing," she said, standing in the desert sunlight, her shadow falling across the cracked earth. "That work, if it's what we think it is, could revolutionize biotechnology. We could develop entirely new approaches to medicine, to agriculture, to environmental remediation. All we need is access to the specimens and the research data. We're prepared to offer $300,000. $300,000. It was wealth beyond what Marcus could even imagine. It was college, a new start, freedom from poverty and struggle. "I need to think about it," Marcus said. "Of course," Dr. Vance replied smoothly. "But don't think too long. This is a unique opportunity. And unfortunately, there are environmental agencies that might have an interest in accessing the property as well. State park services that might want to designate the land. We could help you through all of that. Or it could become very complicated and expensive for you. We're genuinely trying to help." It was a threat dressed in business language. But Marcus didn't accept. Instead, he called the state university. He called a marine biology program at UC Santa Barbara that his grandfather's journal had referenced. He called environmental agencies and scientific societies. And he started writing down everything his grandfather had documented, typing the entries into a laptop he borrowed from a local library, making sure the knowledge existed in multiple places where it couldn't be erased. Deputy Lucas Reyes arrived 3 days later, not because of Marcus's efforts, but because a local rancher had reported activity at the abandoned mine. The deputy found Marcus living in the cabin, maintaining the mine chamber, refusing Dr. Vance's increasingly insistent offers. "What exactly are you protecting here?" Reyes asked, professional but genuinely curious. Marcus showed him, brought him into the mine, showed him the chamber, explained the research, read his grandfather's words to him. And Deputy Reyes, who had grown up in Carrizozo and had known Marcus's grandfather by reputation as the old man in the desert who was either brilliant or crazy, understood immediately. "My wife's sister has a neurological condition," Reyes said quietly. "The doctors say it's degenerative, permanent. But your grandfather's research, these extremophile organisms, the way they adapt and survive, it could help us understand how cells repair damage. If that research gets sold to a corporation and locked up in patent filings and proprietary labs." He didn't finish. He didn't have to. What followed was the thing Marcus had not expected: community. Reyes brought in a researcher from New Mexico State University. The researcher brought in specialists. Articles started appearing in scientific journals about the specimen collection. The local historical society stepped in and began the process of designating the mine as a significant scientific site. A documentary filmmaker wanted to tell the story. Environmental protection groups got involved. Biogenesis Corporation's offer became irrelevant. The research was too public, too important, too documented. Dr. Vance's email stopped. The legal pressure evaporated. Marcus stayed at the mine. He worked with researchers, learned the science his grandfather had pioneered, understood the mechanisms that made these extremophile organisms capable of impossible survival. He enrolled in online classes, then attended a state university while maintaining the mine chamber during summers and breaks. The desert around the mine hadn't changed. It was still vast and cruel and beautiful. Still the color of old blood and rust, still cracked and dry and inhospitable. But beneath that barren surface, life was discovering mechanisms of survival that would shape medicine and agriculture for generations to come. His grandfather had spent 30 years down in the darkness, preserving specimens that no one else valued, documenting work that no institution would fund, trusting that someday someone would understand. And that someone had been Marcus. The mine had seemed worthless because the world's measure of value was limited. An old shaft house, collapsed and rotting. Exhausted mineral veins, useless property in the middle of the desert. But value, it turned out, wasn't always visible on the surface. Value existed in the dedication of a man who worked alone in the darkness for 30 years. Value existed in the belief that the work mattered, even when no one was watching, even when institutions dismissed it as unmarketable. What part of yourself are you willing to abandon in pursuit of what the world tells you is worthwhile?